Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Let me check my volume. I hope everyone is doing okay. I gotta be honest, I had a bit of trepidation thinking about doing this one. People tell me that my channel can get personal. I never look at it that way. I at the very least never necessarily feel that way. I guess there's certain things that I don't necessarily care to talk about one way or the other. Other things I guess I'm more private about. And I guess from a societal standpoint, there's some things like anybody else that people feel some kind of way about, even though technically they probably shouldn't feel any way about it. No, I can't say that. Yeah, I can't say that because that doesn't include me. I was about to say something overly personal for my wife. No, I guess my point is, like a person, like anybody else, there's certain things where you feel some kind of way about, whether you should feel some kind of way about or not. The feeling of itself becomes less important, or the thought of it, meaning whether or not you intellectually should, becomes less important than the feeling itself. Even when you think something, the feeling can have this overriding influence in the way that you go about your affairs. This is why this idea of bias and everything else is kind of built into the process when you have a disposition. There is no such thing as objectivity. But I was reading a story. This gentleman up here, that's Lane Davis. I was reading the story yesterday, and I read it from tip to post, and or you can say pillar to post. Oftentimes when I read stories, I'm an Aries moon. I tend to be overly fast, so I tend to want to get through it. And I want the details. So it's like, I don't want the fluff. Just give me the details. And in this story, I ended up reading everything because I was fascinated by what was being said. And as I read it, I realized there were certain commonalities that I discuss on this channel. And seeing somebody as a whole person, not necessarily at the end point of a set of failures, but in the context of a larger society. And I know that sounds weird, and let me dig into that so I can explain. And looking at it through the context of my own life, and through the context of either a capitalistic lens, a societal lens, and the intermingling between those things. I was fascinated by this. Like I ended up dwelling in this thought, and I thought it would be interesting to discuss for the channel itself, even though I do think it's slightly personal, even though it's not necessarily personal because it doesn't necessarily apply to me. I didn't do anything. There's no black mark or stain. And yet for some reason it feels that way. So Lane Davis was 33-year-old, out of work, unemployed, living at home, essentially destitute, dependent upon his parents for his subsistence. I think he was in his 30s. I think he was like 33 years old. Right-winger, hardcore right-winger that was involved in a bunch of conspiracy theories on some kind of site called, I think it was called Gamergate. At one point, he was an intern for Milo Intern, and he got wrapped up in this right-wing dogma and conspiracy. And apparently, he used to get himself worked up. Like, apparently, the author of the piece said he writes very well in comparison to some of the other maniacs that are on the site. But he would work himself up. He would get angry as he was talking about it. Now, this was interesting for me to read because I have a tendency to look at the world through a lens that annoys my wife. And I started seeing a certain commonality in how I process events. Now, I'm more empathetic for that stuff. And for the most part, if I'm dealing with somebody, I don't necessarily have to talk about politics. It doesn't have to come up. It's not the subsuming thing that needs to be discussed, especially when I know it's not something that we can discuss, if that makes sense. But apparently he wasn't that way. He couldn't make the disassociation. There would be people who have to calm him down because he would work himself up. His dad, I got to be honest, I don't know whether his dad was a leftist or not, or anywhere in between, because it sounds like this guy was somewhat of a lunatic. But apparently, him and his dad used to get into these major fights. And I mean, screaming matches, arguments. And he gets into his head that leftists and progressives are pedophiles. He calls himself, his dad apparently calls him a Nazi one day. He calls his dad a pedophile and stabs his dad in the chest. His dad stumbles out the house. Mother shrieking and screaming. And he keels over. One of the agents of the guards who were outside apparently, or was nearby, draws his gun and Lane takes a knee. The prosecutor's charging it with premeditated murder. He's saying, I'm not guilty because she's trying to make the case that it's not premeditated. If I saw that on the news, I would say a Nazi got mad because his dad called him a Nazi. Fuck him. That's what I would say. To some degree, that's what I say now. But the more honest appraisal of this is, why? Like, why? Like he wasn't always this way. He wasn't born this way. And when you're looking at the situations of his life, even in that piece, you can see this kind of decline where he was destitute. He was in a society, in a world where he felt emasculated. Like this right-wing drivel that tells you you're supposed to be your own man, and a society that tells you you're supposed to be your own man. And he's completely emasculated just because he's stuck at home with his dad and his mom. No skills with which to use. That is no way an excuse. So don't misunderstand me. This is not hugging a Nazi or anything else. There is no excuse for him putting a knife in his dad. And I don't necessarily know if he had mental issues or what. And it sounds like his parents gave him, bent over backwards to give him far more of a chance than I probably would have if I was their parents. I probably would have gotten rid of him a long time ago. But what I just said was true. In a different world where there is more of a society that is adequate, or in a different world where a society was set up as such, where there is not a situation where he needs to be dependent on his dad. Like whatever that particular society is, whether that's a universal basic income where he gets enough to make his own ends while he's continuing to write, because he was writing as an intern. He wasn't getting paid for it. Even though he was supposedly a pretty decent writer, he was looking for his big break. What happens if he's not in this situation where he's under stress? Does he become this Nazi? Does he have this much rage and anger? Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. But I would wager that it would be less. I don't say this, again, the hug a Nazi, and I hate to have to even make the point of saying I'm not saying the hug a Nazi. I'm asking a larger question. Why do people commit these heinous crimes? And can you really just put it on the doorstep of that individual just took a wrong place when you have a lot of individuals that seem to be taking that wrong place? If a large percentage of your society is overweight, is it just the individual choice at that point? Or is there some driver in the society that's pushing people to be overweight? No. I look at this also from a different angle, from my own experience with my uncle. My uncle was not a right-winger. He didn't process that stuff in the political landscape. My uncle spent a bit of time in prison. And he gets out. If I'm being honest, never used to like to be around him. I don't mean that in a bad way. I love my uncle, but he was always out for himself. And one of the things I learned when I was younger is that, and this was from dealing with my mom, that people are different. And you need to engage people in different ways depending upon how those people are. My mom is the nicest person on the planet. She would bend over backwards for you, which means that you should not necessarily push too much in regards to the things that you may want or the things you may need, because she will go the extra mile to try to give it to you, even if it's at her own expense. So don't do it. Don't be that person. By the same token, when dealing with others who are perfectly willing to try to be miserly or try to take more than what they probably should take, then you need to be a bit more aggressive and more rough. It just depends on who you deal with. With my uncle, it was the latter. He gets out of prison. He's living with my grandmother. And to his credit, he did try to find work. And he goes to try to find work. He gets a job. And it takes him a while because many of the places don't want to hire him. He's working at fast food. And while he's working there, I forget how long he's there, but a cop comes to the place, arrests him at his job. Now, the arrest at his job, right off the bat, he forfeited his job at that point. The arrest, find out, ends up being somewhat of a bogus arrest for something that was somewhat of a technicality or some kind of fuck up. But it doesn't matter. He's out of a job. So now you have this grown man who's in his 40s. He's out of work. He's completely dependent upon his mom for subsistence, for living. If you remember, this is somewhat the same or very similar situation as that Nazi with all that stress and that rage that ends up taking this out, or taking all of this from the societal standpoint and processing it through a right-wing lens. My uncle didn't process it through a right-wing lens. He processed it through a different lens. One day, my grandmother gets her hair done. The beautician came to the house. She's on her way out. She sees my uncle, waves to him. He says, "Hey, can you give me a ride?" She says, "Sure." And while he's in the car, he pulls out a knife and he sticks her up. Now, this is all sorts of stupid. This is stupid on multiple counts. That person, certainly you know that person knows who you are. And if you know that person knows who you are, because that person just left the house to which you've been staying, and they know that you're at the house, how are you going to let her go? If you're sticking her up, and this was the question that bugged me like nobody's business. I don't know if the prosecutor asked it, but I damn sure asked it as soon as it happened. Are you going to let her go? And if you let her go, what do you think she's going to do? And if you think she's going to call the cops, then how do you let her go? Which means that if you're taking that crime, you're committing this crime, knowing full well that at the end of this process, either you're going to prison or she's not going home. She gets away at some point. She's shattered by this, somewhat ashamed by this in an odd way. Doesn't necessarily want to bring it up to my grandmother, even though, of course, you have to bring it up. And he's apprehended, of course, and he's prosecuted. Now, here's the thing. I asked him on the phone, what the fuck is wrong with you? That's what I asked him. What's wrong with you? What is your issue? Are you fucking kidding me? What did you think was going to take place? Like, what did you honestly think? How did you think this situation was going to end up? He said, I was at home. He said, I didn't have any money. Everybody was asking me for things. And I flipped. That was his response. I was under stress, essentially pressure. Pressure, buzz pipes. I can't accept this answer, even though I have to accept this answer. It's one of those things of, oh God, dude, that, like I understand it, but I don't particularly like it. If that makes sense. Looking at this from a societal standpoint, I have to ask the question, if we were in a different societal space, would he have committed that issue if those pressures weren't applied to him? And in an odd way, I see somewhat of a similarity between the situation to which he found himself, of his own making, of course. To some degree. I mean, there's a societal thing. And the Nazi found himself. And in that Nazi finding himself in that particular situation where he felt like he was in a no-win situation, and my uncle feels like he's in somewhat of a no-win situation. Granted, both of these situations, to some degree, have a certain degree of choice that's built into it from the individuals that are involved. But it also, to some degree, had a societal headwind where the individuals felt like they couldn't overcome. Poverty shouldn't be allowed in your society at all. And yes, pressure bust pipes. And for one last example, this example is nowhere near like the other two. It's intense, but it's kind of gets the point across. I had a strained relationship with my dad because my dad was never really around. And I had certain ideas in my head on what a dad was supposed to be. And like other people, when they believe that something or someone is not living up to their expectations or standards, they feel some kind of way about it. Now, that's a different question on whether or not you should feel some kind of way about it. You realize at a certain point that your dad is just a guy and he's a fuck up just like you're a fuck up. And there's a certain amount of empathy that comes from realizing that everyone are fuck ups. But I remember seeing him in this one odd occasion where he was at somebody's house and talking to him just fine. I get into my car and I go speeding through a stoplight. But if you ask me to this day why I did that, I couldn't tell you. Now, if you ask me what was the emotional state, I was bothered. I guess I'm making this point that poverty in the society itself and stress in the society itself and making people's lives difficult have consequences. Those consequences can be expressed in all sorts of ways. Sometimes that stuff is expressed on the left. Sometimes that stuff is expressed on the right. And sometimes it's expressed just in crime, drug use. We can have a different world. If you're talking about, you have to ask the question, when we put these people in prison, why are we putting this many people in prison? And what is wrong with your society where your society needs to put this many people in prison? I suspect if the society is being honest with itself, you somewhere have to start with this idea of needs and economics and whether or not we're creating a certain amount of stress just based on the lives of the people as we hit them over the head and take money out of their pocket as they go from cradle to grave. We need a different world. And we're not going to get rid of crime and poverty and all this other stuff. Or I should say, this idea of crime and mental health needs to be re-examined, especially in the context of economics and a social system that allows certain states to propagate itself. Jeff Bezos has $140 billion. There should not be any poverty in this society with somebody walking around with $140 billion. And it's not just Bezos. We can have a different world. So, look, I guess the point of this video is showing this similarity between how people process stress. And that processing of stress gets put out in weird ways. Sometimes it goes out to the right. Sometimes it goes out just through basic crime. But we never look at those things as being systemic. We look at those things as being individual occurrences purely within the scope of the individual who made certain individual choices that put him afoul of the law, purely from an individual standpoint, never from the standpoint that there are societal ills that are propagating certain behaviors that even though they may present themselves in various ways, that the root of many of those causes, whether it's drug use, whether it's, in this case, in his very specific case, it seems like he was going down a rabbit hole based on the economic dimensions of his life. Now, I don't know that as an absolute. I can't say that as an absolute, and it's possible that the article was written in a way that was highlighting the economic difficulties of the individual. But I do see some similarities from the standpoint of my uncle and the way he was processing it versus the way that this particular guy was possibly processing it. And I have to ask if there was a different society would those people behave in those ways. And if that answer is they may have behaved differently if the societal factors were differently, then the problem is your society. It's not purely the fault of the individual. We need to start looking at crime and drug use in systemic ways, not necessarily blaming the individual for something that may be propagated with the society itself. So, let's see. I'm not going to keep this one long. I just thought this one was an interesting intersection, let's call it that, between a Nazi and a family member. I read that article and I thought, God, that's fucked up that he did that. And then I thought, but if he was in a different world, would he have done that? Meaning, he wasn't born a Nazi. And I understand he may have immersed himself into a particular culture that propagated the behavior. You know, like the Gamergate culture and everything else. And not just that. I mean, if you have people who are liking your videos and liking you pushing conspiracy theory and everything else, you may be more emboldened to do it. So fair enough. But the rage, assume for the moment that it wasn't a mental illness. Where did that rage come from? Was there an economic dimension to the rage itself? And I'm just saying, in my uncle's case, there was definitely an economic dimension to the, you can call it flip out or burnout. Him flipping out and stabbing his dad is very possibly not purely related to the conspiracy theory. It may have very well also been related to the economic dimensions of his life and this idea of him being completely emasculated, living at home with his mom and dad. Imagine it's not an easy thing. So I'll end this. I don't want to keep this one long because I have a bunch of others. I have an entire list. Look at this. I have an entire list of these things to go through. So I'm not going to keep this one. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support through Patreon. Thanks, everyone.